Dan, are you with us? How are you doing, sir?
We're here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us, Dan. I know this was a bit last minute. We had actually a gentleman who was before the first wave on Utah Beach with the fourth ID. Unfortunately, he was very ill. So thank you so much for joining us at the last minute. I just wanted to introduce you to a few people, if that's okay. I think we first came across each other while back in 2012, 13, when I was writing The Liberator. You are a proud veteran of my favorite US division in World War II, the 45th Infantry Division. You belonged actually to the 157th Infantry Regiment that also featured Felix Sparks, later General Felix Sparks, who was there at the liberation of Dachau. And I think that you are, to my mind, and I don't want to embarrass you, Dan, I think you're one of the most well thought out, most articulate eyewitnesses to the climax of World War II who's still with us. We only have 119,000 of you guys and women around today from the greatest generation, and I think you're probably among the most articulate and insightful of those last great survivors. So thank you so much for being with us today. Can I start by asking you, where were you during the Battle of the Bulge? Where were you today in 1944?
I was in the 7th Army Hospital. I sprained my ankle about December 14th. So I spent about the next 2 weeks in convalescing from a sprained ankle. When you go to the hospital, all your mail stops. And while I was in the hospital, I received one day 13 packages from home. My mail caught up with me, and I had to share that with the people in the hospital whom I didn't know, but I was happy to. So I got back to I was with the 44th Division at that time, and I got back on about January 2nd. And the 44th had withstood the first attacks of Operation Nordwind.
So, Danny, tell us about your background. Where did you grow up? How did you end up being in the European theater at this time of the year in 1944?
Okay. I graduated from high school in June 1943 in Austin, Minnesota. And in anticipation of going into the service, I wanted to get into the Navy V-12 program, but I couldn't qualify because of my eyesight. So I took the Army A-12 test to qualify for the Army College program, which I did. I took that, and they said, join the reserve. So I joined the reserve my senior year in high school. And then I graduated on June 6th, got my notice on June 15th, and was inducted on June 23rd at a 4-month basic training in the infantry at Fort McClellan, and then went into the Army College program. And I was at St. Louis University studying engineering, and we were there for 5 months, and the entire engineering program folded in one day, and we all went to different units of the infantry units, and my group in St. Louis went to the 44th Division. They were on maneuvers at the time in Louisiana. And then we went to Camp Phillips in Salina, Kansas, for the last finishing touches before going overseas. And in late August of 1944, we sailed from Boston, and we went on the first ship that went directly to France.
Wow.
Everybody else went to the UK and then got ferried over. We went directly to Cherbourg. We got there probably about September 10th. And there wasn't much of a harbor. It was a real rinky-dink operation. And we bivouacked in Normandy for 2 or 3 weeks before we started fighting. And then on, I think it was October 14th, the 44th Division went online near Luneville, and we replaced the 79th, the foxholes of the 79th Division. They straggled back, ones and twos and threes, dragging their gear. And our officers were really upset by this, but we realized that the 79th had been there fighting almost from D-Day, and they were entitled to relief. So that's when we started in the middle of October.
Just want to make 2 points. Number one, congratulations on being a quiz kid. That's what you were nicknamed, wasn't it? The ASTP programmers were
Okay.
all those quiz kids because you were so smart. And also, what a tragedy that you didn't get to visit England and date an English rose or meet my fellow countrymen. Were you upset by that you didn't get to go to England?
Well, I was upset, but I got to go in the summer of 1948. I went over for the Olympics.
Oh, wow.
I spent the entire summer in
Right.
England. We're working in some farming camps and logging camps. And then I saw the Olympics, I saw Wimbledon. So I had a wonderful course in English history in college before I went. So I saw the Stonehenge and I saw everything else that you need to see when you're there. A lot of Shakespeare.
So I'm trying to imagine what it was like for you because gentlemen like yourself in the ASTP program, most of them thought they were going to be in, technical positions behind the lines, that, they were not going to end up as privates in platoons sitting in foxholes, hugging their buddies to share body warmth. Were you really disappointed that you ended up in the situation that you did? How did you feel at the time?
Well, let me tell you, I had a very good 4-month infantry basic training.
Right.
When we folded and went to the infantry, I at least knew what I was getting into. Everybody who went into ASTP, first of all, you had to go in as a private. And quite a few of these guys had been sergeants in the Air Force and the quartermaster in the ordnance, and they'd taken and cut from sergeant to private so they could go to college. They go to college, and a few months later, the whole program folds. They really howled and screamed, and they wrote their congressman, but not a single one of them made it back to their old outfit or made it back to their old rank. And so I just took it for what was happening. When you volunteer in the Army, you get what comes along.
So what was your first duty? What was your rank? What was your first duty in combat?
I was in K Company of 324th Regiment, and I was a BAR gunner in the 2nd platoon. Sergeant Schultz was my platoon sergeant, and I was a BAR gunner because I was tall and so I carried 22 pounds. I didn't particularly care for it, but that's what I went overseas as a BAR gunner.
And what was your first experience of combat?
We replaced the 79th Division foxholes. We were in their foxholes. Everything going over was very secret. And about the second night online, sitting in the foxholes, the Germans came on with a loudspeaker opposite us, and they said, "Greetings, men of the 44th Division." They told us what ship we had come over on. They told us when we had landed. And they said, "Why don't you come on over and have hot food with us instead of sitting there eating the K ration?" That was my first night or two. And the big push began on November 13th. We had a big advance. What I remember about October, November, December was the worst European winter in 40 years. And we were just miserably cold and wet the whole time and not very well equipped. We finally got some good boots. Otherwise, we had wet shoes all the time. And trench foot was a big problem, and people frostbite. Then in the middle of December, I sprained my ankle. So I'm in the hospital for 2 or 3 weeks. And then when I come back, I'm with the 44th Division. Operation Nordwind is winding down. And on January 26th, a runner comes to our platoon and says, Dougherty, report to company headquarters with all your gear. So I get there, and here's Leonard Parker, Pinky, we called him. And I said, what's up, Pinky? He said, I don't know. And the first sergeant comes out and says, Dan, you're a staff sergeant. Pinky, you're a staff sergeant. You're going to the 45th Division. Good luck. There was a Jeep waiting for us. We didn't even have time to go back and say goodbye to guys we'd been with for 10 months and been fighting with for 3 months. And that afternoon, we ended up in a little village in Alsace where C Company of the 157th Regiment was being reformed after having been one of 6 companies totally captured intact.
Do you remember hearing about the Ardennes offensive? Did you actually call it the Battle of the Bulge at the time? Do you remember hearing about what was happening to the north of you?
Well, I heard about it, but I don't actually remember very much. I was in the hospital, and other than Stars and Stripes, I don't know what access I would have had. But I didn't hear an awful lot about it at the time. I don't remember much. When I got back from the hospital, then the guys told me the 44th had been attacked on the midnight, on 11 o'clock on New Year's Eve, at the beginning of Operation Nordwind. The 100th Division and the 44th were attacked. And then a few days later, the Germans recrossed the Rhine again, trying to take Strasbourg.
Tell us a bit about Operation Northwind, because it's an attack by Hitler's forces that most people don't know anything about. Tell us a little bit about Operation Northwind.
Well, when Hitler realized that he was not going to be successful in what we call the Bulge, he still had some troops he had not used, and he turns to Himmler, who by this time he runs the SS, but he's also been appointed in charge of defending the lower half of the Western Front for the Germans. He doesn't know beans about military matters, but he has a pretty good general, and Hitler turns to him and says, here, take these troops and attack the 7th Army because they're very thin. Well, the reason we were very thin was, as your previous speaker was talking about, when Patton's forces had to go north to help contain the Bulge, we in the 7th Army had to spread out and cover what had been the 3rd Army front. And so we were thin. And on New Year's Eve, they attacked. They came over across the Rhine then again on about January 3rd or 4th, and they made deep incursions into the 7th Army. But they ran out of their supplies, and we finally contained it. And Lisa Pomoy has written the whole really big story about that. The 42nd Division commissioned that from her.
So, Dan, tell us about the reality of combat, if you can. It's become a cliche that the sons and daughters of the so-called greatest generation always say, why didn't my dad talk about what happened in World War II? Why didn't he share his stories with me? Did you not talk about World War II for quite a while, except with your buddies? I mean, let's talk about
I never had that problem.
Thank goodness.
When I went to college, I got there in 46, and there were a lot of guys who had exactly the same experience I had, and we used to talk among ourselves at college all the time about it. I never had.
Sorry, carry on, then.
What's that?
Carry on.
I'm sorry.
Keep going. Keep talking.
Okay. Well, we lost a son, the big tragedy in our life, and I started talking things out with my with the therapist later on, and I discovered I was still carrying some baggage about the corpses at Dachau. And so I talked that out. And so that enabled me to talk about it very readily. I understand when people say I can't talk about it, but I can.
So let's talk about it then. You, when you joined the 157th, that amazing regiment of the finest U.S. Infantry Division of World War II, the 45th, what was your first experience of combat with the Thunderbirds, the 45th?
Our first assignment after we reformed the company in 1 week. Brand new officers, brand new sergeants. Well, the sergeants were from the other 7th Army Division, brand new privates from the replacement depots. We trained for 1 week, and then we went back on the line at the same place where Sparks' battalion was captured.
Yep, Reipersweiler.
Reipersweiler. We were there for 2 weeks. That was our first experience. I led a patrol there that night, one night. We ran into Germans on the patrol and finally got back. And I ran into a tracked down fellas after the war, and I was calling a fella, and he said, "Oh, I remember you, Dougherty. I was on that patrol." That was our first experience, and then we got pulled off the line and had river crossing training and training for attacking bunkers. Well, that was pretty. It was nice to be off the line, but it was pretty ominous stuff with the Rhine up ahead and the Siegfried Line. So, our really first big problem was March 18th. We hit the Siegfried Line, and I'm going to take a drink here. We knew something was up because the night before, nobody was talking about it, but a fella came around to say goodbye. He was being rotated home, and he said, "Good luck, fellas." And the next morning we had tanks with us, and we went right straight into the Siegfried Line. And of course, we get to the barrier with the tank ditch and the cement cones and the barbed wire, and the tanks couldn't go any farther. And we crawled down into that ditch and get on the other side and start walking through the Siegfried Line, and we're making pretty good progress. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes the mother of all artillery barrages, because the Germans know right where we are. And in our section, we were in very heavy woods. So everything comes in, and there's just one tree hit after another. And we had 36 casualties that day in C Company. We had 6 officers in the company. 5 of them were casualties. In my platoon, we had 6 sergeants. 5 of them, including myself, were casualties. And we're walking in the Siegfried Line, and I felt this little stun in my left foot. So I sit down in the middle of the Siegfried Line, take off my boot, and sure enough, right across the ball of my shoe, the foot, there was a slit. And then I had two socks on, and I took them off, and there was a slit right through the socks. And so I had a little wound in the bottom of my ball of my left foot. I could hardly see it, and there wasn't much blood. But when you got hit, you were supposed to go back. So I went back, and I was got to the field hospital. And when the nurse anesthetist came over to administer the sodium pentothal, I said, "Now I want that shrapnel." She said, "Sure, soldier." And until I wake up out of the surgery and there's no shrapnel. So they give me a Purple Heart, and I have my 2 socks with the slit in it, and I wrap it around the Purple Heart and take it over to the Red Cross tent. And I said, "Now here, please mail this home." They said, "Sure, soldier," but it arrived home without the socks. So I have nothing. I can't even find the scar now. But to tell you how bad it was, I played ping pong 2 days after having surgery on my foot, and
Wow.
somebody saw me, and I was out of there on my way back. I was
So,
the first one back.
wow. So how old were you, Dan? How old were
I
you
was
at this?
19.
19. How many times were you wounded in World War II?
Just one.
Just one.
The other time was a sprained ankle.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So you get across the Siegfried Line. How long did it take the 157th to get across the Siegfried Line?
I got hit that morning. I think it took them 2 or 3 days, 4 days to get through. And then they're making very good progress, and they come to Aschaffenburg.
Right.
And they had reason to think that they would find white sheets hanging out of the homes in Aschaffenburg because Patton's Third Army had already claimed they had taken it, which meant their tanks had come to it and gone around. But unbeknownst to everybody, a colonel had rounded up 5,000 German troops and given an ultimatum and said, dug them in and said, you will defend Aschaffenburg. And the 157th gets there and discover they have a real fight on their hands. I missed almost all of that. I got back the last 2 days of the Aschaffenburg battle.
Let's give a bit of context to this. So you crossed the Siegfried Line and then the Rhine. What was the date that you crossed the Rhine?
I crossed it in a truck coming back from the hospital. My unit crossed it in speedboats.
Right.
And I don't think they had much action, but they're.
So this is, first Rhine crossing is the 9th of March. The Rhine is the last great natural barrier between the Allies in the West and Berlin. And then we're across the Rhine, across the Siegfried Line, and then you are in Aschaffenburg. And this is late March, early April of 1945, isn't it?
Yes.
Aschaffenburg is in central Germany, and most people have never heard of Aschaffenburg. It's another of those towns that were heavily defended, that became fortresses under Hitler's direct command. What was so appalling about the combat in Aschaffenburg? Why was it so bad?
I think it was because the colonel was a real, he was determined that they were going to prevent the army from advancing there. And he had given the German soldiers, an ultimatum: you will dig in and fight, and you will defend Aschaffenburg. And the 157th, finally, after 2 or 3 days, realized they had a real battle on their hands. And Ed Spears, who was an officer in the regiment headquarters, decided, why don't we drop an ultimatum on them? And so he put together an ultimatum. They translated into German. They ran off 200 copies on the mimeograph machine. And Ed took it up in a Piper Cub artillery spotter and dropped 200 copies on top of Aschaffenburg, telling them how to surrender. And it did absolutely nothing. And so they actually ended up using flamethrowers to end the battle at Aschaffenburg. I got back on April 2nd, and the battle ended about 3rd or 4th. So I missed most of that, but C Company lost 23 guys at Aschaffenburg. It was a very hard battle for both sides.
And yet, this is only a few weeks from the end of the war. The Germans are putting up a hell of a resistance, especially the SS. I should add, Dan, that that I met Mr. Spears, sadly passed away, but he served in World War II with you, Korea, and Vietnam. And I will never, ever forget interviewing him back in Asheville in 2011 with several other members of your regiment at a reunion. And he was an extremely impressive man. And I understand that you knew him pretty well, yeah?
Well, he had commanded my company in Italy and France.
Right.
And then by the time I joined it, he's now in regimental headquarters. So we had a different thing, but I met him at reunions. That's the first time I met Ed. And he wrote some articles for me for my newsletter. So I got to know him pretty well.
I know this is about you, Dan, but can you tell us a little bit about Felix Sparks? Because you were actually there when he was in in the 157th Infantry Regiment. Can you tell us about Sparks a little bit?
Well, I never met him during the war. When we came into Dachau, he was leading the 3rd Battalion troops there, but I never had any encounter with them. So I didn't meet Sparks until after the war at the reunions. But he was a very, very impressive guy. And he really ran a wonderful reunion association year after year after year.
So take us from Aschaffenburg. You guys have had a very bloody fight. Some of you are wondering, why on earth don't the Germans just give up? How long is this going to carry on? And then take us toward Dachau. What was your journey from Aschaffenburg to Dachau like?
Okay, after Aschaffenburg, we actually had a 3-day break, and I had a camera carried by the kitchen crew. So I took a lot of pictures, and there's quite a good picture of my platoon. But on the 15th of November, we arrive at Nuremberg, and the 45th Division, the 42nd, and the 3rd Division have it surrounded. And if anybody but Hitler had been in charge, they would have surrendered the city. But instead, they defended it. And so for the first day, we just sat out there and watched the Army Air Corps planes. It was Army Air Corps in those days. Just dive bomb the city over and over and over again with no ACAT, no opposition, and they just turned it into total rubble. And 5 days later, the 3 divisions met in the center of Nuremberg, and we had a 1-day rest, and then the 45th and the 42nd are immediately dispatched towards Munich. The goal now is to get there as soon as we can, so as to deny the Germans an opportunity to organize a defense like they had at Nuremberg. And on the 26th of November, we arrive at the Danube. And all the bridges are blown, so we're waiting for them to bring up Army ducks. And I write to my parents, said, here I am, humming the Danube waltz, looking at the Danube River. And then I wrote on the letter, I have my letters, I'm not supposed to tell you where I am, but our lieutenant never reads the mail. The reason I knew that was that at Nuremberg, Ed Wilkins, who is in my platoon, who posthumously received the Medal of Honor, he was killed at Nuremberg. He was the platoon guide, and so I became platoon guide at Nuremberg. And one of the first instructions I got from Lieutenant Penny was he didn't want to waste any more time reading mail. He said, you just sign my name on all the letters. And so I signed Lieutenant James Penny Jr. on all the letters going home from Nuremberg on. My mother saved those envelopes. And one day, without thinking, I threw all the envelopes away. And some of those envelopes had my signature, my writing there of James Penny's name on there.
So
we got across the Danube, but it's very harrowing because in my duck, there were about 7 or 8 of us. We get halfway across the Danube and the engine stopped. Well, the Danube is a very swiftly flowing river. And down the Danube we went. We were quite literally a sitting duck. And the engineer finally gets us across. But we're way down the river from the division. And I'm the ranking non-com in the group. So I said, we're not going to go back up the river. They're moving so fast. So we went off at a right oblique. And later on the next afternoon, we found the 45th Division. We had gone down the river so far. We were lucky we didn't get shot at. Yeah.
So this is
on the evening of the 28th, we slept in the woods, which was very unusual because by this time we're almost insisting that we get to sleep in homes.
Right.
And I remember it was woods, and in the morning we assembled, and the commanding officer said, guys, gather around. I have to give you special orders. Nothing like that had ever happened. And what he said was he alerted us to the fact that the division was in the vicinity of a concentration camp. And as I remember his telling us, it was very important that all possible witnesses be kept alive. Well, this meant nothing to us. We didn't know what a concentration camp was.
Dan, I just want to stop you here a little bit. So it's late April 1945. You've been on the line for quite a while. Tell me about the psychological state of you and your comrades, because I've read so many accounts and talked to quite a few veterans who said that as the war came to an end, there were a lot of people that felt very jittery, very nervous, because they knew that if they could just survive a few more weeks, they'd go home. Did you witness that? Did you see that?
I experienced it because I had an uncle that was killed in World War I. He was killed in the middle of October of 1918. The telegram arrived after the armistice. It was a real hard for his family because the armistice happens as far as they know their son's alive, and then they get the telegram. And so nobody was taking any chances at the end of the war. Nobody was volunteering for anything. The whole goal was to stay alive. And that's exactly the way was motivating us.
You had no idea. Sparks said after the war that it was beyond the human imagination what you saw at Dachau. Did you have any idea even what a concentration camp was? What were you expecting when you heard the words concentration camp?
Well, at that point, we didn't know anything more than we might have read in Stars and Stripes magazine, because by that time, some camps had been liberated. But we hadn't spent a lot of time reading about that. I really didn't know. The big shock was coming up on the train. As I said, when we were told we were in the vicinity of a concentration camp, it didn't mean anything to us because not only did we not know what a camp was, our C Company was in reserve that day. And I remember a very easy stop and go morning, but about 1 o'clock that afternoon, our runner comes. It may have been Fred Abraham, who's a real child of the Holocaust, who was a runner in my company. He came in, he said, C Company is going into a concentration camp to relieve I Company because I Company is going berserk. This was our introduction to, whoops. Are we still on?
Yeah, you're still with us, Dan.
Okay.
I want to back up a little bit and give our viewers a little bit of context here. So Dachau concentration camp, established in 1933. Please bear with me, Dan. Established in 1933 as the first of what became a vast archipelago of evil, suffering, and death. 1933. We're now talking about the 29th of April, 1945. Sorry about that. We had a little bit of disturbance there. April 29th, 1945, which the inmates after the war described as the Day of the Americans. This is the Day of Liberation. So we have over 30,000 inmates in Dachau from over 50 nationalities. We have at least 2,500 Catholic priests. This is a truly multinational place of suffering. Sparks is in charge of the first Americans. I know this is controversial. The first Americans from the 157th, including I Company, who enter the concentration camp in the mid-morning of the 29th of April, 1945. And you arrive on the scene, as you said, about 1 o'clock. Oh. So you mentioned earlier on that I Company had gone crazy. I Company is the spearhead of Sparks's force that goes in that morning, the very first Americans into Dachau. What happened with I Company? Why did they go crazy?
Okay. When we were approaching Dachau, there was a railway track that paralleled the road on our left. It was a single track. And we got up and we discovered there's a train on the track, and it consists of a long string of boxcars and a few gondola cars. And all of a sudden, we make the horrifying discovery. The doors are open, that the cars contain just totally emaciated human corpses. Nothing but skin and bones, all still in the remnants of their striped uniform. It just kind of blew the soldiers away. And I remind you, we were hardcore infantry troops used to death and destruction, but nobody gets used to walking up to a train full of bodies. Turns out there were 39 boxcars with 2,310 corpses, which is about 60 bodies per car. And we walked by each one of those cars. And it was, some of the soldiers had a very difficult time that day handling their emotions. Some were crying and some were yelling and cursing. And this is what I Company had come upon earlier. And then they immediately started rounding up guards in the mid-morning. We didn't get there. We learned about it about 1 o'clock. We didn't get there till about 3:30 or 4. But I Company rounding up bodies and prisoners, and they're holding them, some of them in the coal yard. And you had done several things with the memorial here on the events in the coal yard that day with the photos. There was plenty of provocation. Some of the soldiers just had a very difficult time, and in the course of rounding up the guards, there was a breakdown in discipline among some of the troops and different unrelated actions in the camp, during which a few dozen of the guards were killed without benefit of a trial.
Dan, tell us what you saw when you got to the so-called scene of the crime. This is the coal yard at the center of KZ Dachau, where mostly often SS men who had been rounded up from an infirmary have been lined up with their hands in the air, and then a group from I Company had opened fire on them, a group commanded by Lieutenant Bill Walsh. At least a dozen of these men, POWs, killed, maybe 2 or 3 dozen wounded, the others lying in the dirt in the coal yard, pretending to be dead. When did you arrive in the coal yard, and what did you see?
Okay. We arrived at Dachau about, I put it at 3:30, 4 o'clock. Others put it a little earlier, sometime that middle of the late afternoon. When we went through an opening, I never understood where we were until later this year. I'll tell you about it. But we went through the opening. Our platoon leader, James Penny, said, "Okay, guys, fan out and look for guards." Well, this is 25 acres. He's telling this to a platoon of 20 guys. Fan out we did. Some of them went to the right, some went straight ahead, and I went to the left with a few other guys. And we almost immediately come to the coal yard. So this is late afternoon, and it's a very strange sight because there are the corpses of the guards on the ground, but standing around, milling around, looking at them, are about a dozen, 15 civilian reporters from all over the world. They're already in the camp before we are. And nobody there to tell us what had happened. We just figured it was I Company's handiwork, is what it turned out to have been. And then from then on, we spent our entire time on the west side of the camp. Just over the wall from the coal yard was the SS hospital. You can see it in the photo with the Red Cross on the top. And I and Killingbeck went through the hospital. It was all empty by the time we got there. I think I Company went in and emptied it out. I spent all my time on the west side maintaining a security post where our guys were out looking for guards. And incredibly, late afternoon, they found 2 guards and took them. I don't know where they took them, but somebody took them back. And then it turned dark, and I spent my evening that night sleeping in a home that had housed one of the senior members of the SS. Lovely home.
So I think it's the following day that the 45th Infantry Division newspaper has a bold headline declaring, "This is why we fought." Tell us about how haunted you were or still are by what you saw at Dachau. What were the images that you couldn't erase?
Well, it's the image of I never saw the prison. So I never saw a large group. I saw a few prisoners who were outside of the prison. They told the prisoners to stay inside the camp, and most of them did. But there were a few outside that were trying to help the soldiers. But our experience was that I'll just never forget was coming upon that train of corpses. That's the really horrifying experience of my life, and. That night, my platoon slept in a home that had housed one of the senior members of the SS. And we talked until about midnight because we knew we'd had a mind-boggling experience that day. We just couldn't get over the contrast between our home that we were sleeping in, and which was on the compound, and then the total depravity outside. And we talked until about midnight. I had a reunion after the war with Ben Ewing, who was our platoon sergeant. He remembered going upstairs in that home and finding a children's nursery with toys on the floor and a crucifix on the wall. It was a very, very difficult day. But we didn't have much time to think about it because I was determined from listening to the other guys to get out and look around the next morning because there's so much I had not seen, but we never had a chance. We were out of there before dawn to resume the attack on Munich. And we're walking quickly to catch up. Turns out the other platoons of C Company had been relieved that night, and we had gone back to the town of Dachau and slept. Why we slept in the camp, I don't know. But we caught up with them, and then on that morning, we come to Allach, which is the big subcamp, the largest of the Dachau subcamps. And that was another whole experience because here there were the prisoners, the guards have fled, there were no corpses. It was a totally different experience, just one big jubilation. And we gave them immediately all of our K rations and gave them all our cigarettes, we gave them all our candy. And there are photos of the C Company guys standing there at Allach.
Tell us a little bit more about that day, Dan, because I think that it's important to stress that, you know, you were there right at the end. You were there when Americans stopped genocide, when the whole reason, rather, for the death of 138,000 Americans during the liberation of Europe. Finally, you had an explanation. You're at the end of that horrible odyssey, and you are seeing why so many of your friends had been killed, why there had been so much suffering. You're seeing liberation.
Yeah. Well, at Allach, as I said, it was a totally different experience from the day before, which became a very ugly scene at Dachau. Whereas at Allach, it's just one big jubilation. The prisoners immediately when they saw us, they realized we were the U.S. Army. The celebration began. I talked with an elderly prisoner who was from Warsaw. He was a doctor, and he said that because he was a doctor, the Germans have treated him a little deferentially. He was able to minister a little bit to his fellow prisoners. There was a potato cellar just outside of the camp, and we let the prisoners out to get the potatoes. And then our officer said, well, you can't let them out anymore. They have to stay inside. So we closed the gate again, and then we got the potatoes and threw them over the fence to the prisoners. We were there about 3 or 4 hours, And then we are relieved by K Company, and we continue our trench walking on into Munich. And we're approaching Munich with great apprehension because we figure it's going to be another Nuremberg, where we fought for 5 days. We had 3 guys killed in Nuremberg. But along the way, we learned that the early troops that morning of the 45th and the 42nd attacking Munich had run into very little resistance. And we walked all the way into downtown Munich that night and slept in a warehouse that night. And the next morning it was announced the 45th Division would occupy Munich. And that meant for us the war was over.
I believe that, sorry, carry on, Dan.
What's that?
Carry on, please. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we they have to have housing, and they said for housing you were to commandeer private homes. So Ben Ewing and I, he was a platoon sergeant, I was the assistant platoon sergeant. We went up to the home, knocked on the door, and Baroness von Schaffner comes to the door. And Ben says, "Ma'am, we're going to billet troops in your home. We'll give your family 1 bedroom in the kitchen, and we're going to take the rest of the house." And she says, "Okay." She spoke very good English. We walked across the street, and these were lovely big homes in Munich in a very nice section. And we knocked on the door, and Herr Steimer and his wife and 2 very good-looking teenage daughters come to the door. And Ben says, he repeats this, one of the daughters speaks English. "We're going to billet troops in your home. We'll give your family 1 bedroom in the kitchen, and we're going to take the rest of the home." And the daughter translates that to her husband, her father, and he says, 9999. And Ben Ewing, I had a reunion with him after the war. I said, "You remember what you said?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, I was standing there, and what you said was you turned to the daughter and said, 'You explain to your father that if this is not a satisfactory arrangement, we will take your entire house and your family can go live at Dachau.'" Well, of course, that ended the conversation. But I cite that because how quickly things changed. We lived with these German families for a month in their homes. Our platoon occupied 3 different homes. And, by the end of it, I celebrated my 20th birthday in that home, and the Germans baked a cake and decorated it with little American flags. And one day, the first thing the Germans had to do was turn in their weapons. And that morning, Baroness von Schachter came down the steps carrying a double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. She said, "I have to turn this in. If you'd like it, take it." So I took it and mailed it home. And it stood in my closet for 50 years. And finally, in the 1990s, I decided I'd put it back in the hands of the German family. And I tracked down the 5-year-old grandson of Baroness von Schachter, now living in the same house, married with 3 children in the 1990s. And I wrote to him and said, "I have your grandfather's shotgun. If you'd like it, I'll mail it." He said, "Like it, we'll come and get it." And the next summer, their family vacationed in the United States, and they came and we had a return of the shotgun party. I gave him back his grandfather's shotgun. Well, this last April, we were back for the 78th anniversary, and the von Schachters invited us to their home. Our family, there were 9 of us, and it was Wolf's. He was the 5-year-old boy. It was his 80th birthday and 83rd birthday. So we had a celebration. I saw the shotgun again this last April.
Dan, how did it feel to go back? I think that you're one of the very few survivors from the liberation in terms of an eyewitness from the US Army. How did it feel to go back this April to Dachau?
Well, we were all set to go in 2020, which would have been the 75th anniversary. And I understood that about a dozen different liberators had planned to go back. And then at the last minute, that was all canceled because of COVID. But so then this year earlier, they surprised us and they invited any liberators and any of the survivors to come as their guests of the Germans. And so I went, we had to hustle because we'd let our passports lapse, and our family scrambled around, and 9 members of our family accompanied my wife and me in April. And there were just 2 of us liberators. Bud Gauze from the 42nd and I were the only 2 of the liberators, and there were about 15 of the survivors. And it was a very, very interesting experience because I learned a lot about where we had entered. I had never known where in the camp we had entered after coming off of the train. And I had a long session with Alex Pierman on the Dachau Memorial Site staff, and he showed me exactly where C Company went in, and we figured out exactly where it was that we had split up, and some of us had gone to the thing. Well, I learned a lot about how I entered, and then the Germans have done a huge excavation of the Allach subcamp. And they took us on a tour of that. There are no buildings remaining of it, but they showed us where the Jewish camp was and where the non-Jewish camp was. And Bill Lowenberg, who was a very prominent industrialist in San Francisco, had worked in that BMW plant while he was at Allach. And 50 years after the liberation of Allach, the Jewish community in San Francisco honored about 100 of us who had liberated camps. And Bill Lowenberg put this thing around my neck at the lunch before the service that day. He said, he came over to our table and said, "Which one of you is Dougherty?" And I stood up and he said, "50 years ago today, you liberated me at Allach." Well, Bill and I became very good friends, and he was eventually a member of the board of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and very, very active in supporting it. He died a few years ago.
Do you know of any other liberators like yourself, Dan? Anybody else from the 45th, the Thunderbird Division that's still alive that was there that day?
I don't know of any. As far as I know, I'm the only one in the 40th in C Company. But we don't know because, after the war, we were all discharged and went our separate ways. And if they didn't join the 157th Association, nobody will know anything about them. So there may well be some survivors of C Company out there that we just never know about, but I don't know about any. And the 157th Association now has ended because there just aren't enough people to attend the functions.
We have a really good question here from Colin. How do you feel being called the greatest generation of the United States?
Oh, I don't know. I don't spend much time worrying about that.
Well, we all know that it's a book title, The Greatest Generation. But anyway, you definitely belong to a great, great generation, Dan. We sadly are coming towards the end of our time. I just wanted to say, without becoming too emotional, that you are one of the great, great men of this country that I've ever gotten to know and interview. What you did in World War II was unbelievable. You gave this country enormous prestige and moral authority that has lived off ever since. You did something absolutely remarkable, and every European should offer you great gratitude. And I certainly, as a European, will always, always be deeply grateful for everything you and your comrades did in Europe almost 80 years ago. Thank you so, so much, Dan. And thank you for being with us today. You're a gem. You're a superstar in my eyes. And thank you so much for your time. It's been a great, great delight and honor to spend time with you. You are one of the last important voices of the end of the World War II as an American. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome. Good to be here.
With that, I'm going to hand back to my partner, my great colleague, Holly Rotundi in DC. Just wanted to say thank you to everybody on this 79th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Thanks for joining us and hope to see you next time. Thanks again, Dan. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.